Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the My Horse University webinar on healthy horse housing. Today, our speaker is Dr. Christine Skelly. She is an extension specialist and faculty member here in the Animal Science Department at Michigan State University. And we're really happy to have her here today to tell us a little bit about keeping our horse healthy as we have them in the barn and out in the field, and just really appreciate having her here today. Just a couple things to note. This webinar is being recorded, so we will share the recording up on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A option that is located at the bottom of your screen. You can just click on that, type in your question or comment, and click on send. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Skelly.
Hi, it's great having you here. It's actually nice to be talking to a group of people because right now our Michigan State University campus is pretty empty. So all the students went home as of last week, and we've got 1 week of quiet before summer school starts on Monday. So it's we appreciate you being here. So for my next slide. For this talk, we are going to talk about how housing influences horse behavior, body temperature regulation, respiratory health, and the skeletal strength of the horse. A lot of times when I work with people either renovating an old horse facility or old dairy barn to house horses, or developing a new horse facility, people are very concerned with how warm a facility will be. And a lot of times they're more concerned with their own comfort level than they are the horses. Or they're worried about what the facility is going to look like. Or they have an idea in their head. Maybe they've always boarded their horse and their horse has always been stalled throughout its life. And so they think that that's the best or most appropriate way to house horses. They just don't have any experience doing anything any differently. So we're going to look and compare both keeping horses in more traditional indoor stalls versus housing horses in groups outside. So when we're putting all this information into context, we can use the 5 freedoms from the Farm Animal Welfare Council to help guide us along in this journey. The Farm Animal Welfare Council originated in the United Kingdom, but the 5 freedoms developed for livestock are pretty well accepted throughout the world when we consider fair treatment of livestock. So when we're looking at the 5 freedoms, we're looking at keeping our horses free from hunger and thirst, free from discomfort, free from pain, injury, or disease, free to express normal behavior, and free from fear and distress. So as we're looking at it from the horse's perspective then, am I comfortable in my environment? Do I have adequate food and water? Can I engage in normal behaviors that I want to engage in? Am I healthy? Am I well managed? Am I being treated fairly in a calm manner through all types of either training or riding or management systems? So if we look at it from the horse's perspective, we also have to consider where the horse came from. Now, not necessarily the horses we have in our backyard, but originally they evolved. Their anatomy has evolved, their digestive anatomy, the way their brains are wired have evolved from when they were a plains dweller species. So when they were out on the plain, they were primarily creatures of prey. So the predators, the big cats and whatnot, would look to them for a food source. So that's one of the reasons their eyes are located on the side of their head so that they can look out far into the distance. They can look out behind them. They can actually see to either side with their monocular vision to find prey species and to then to leave the scene. So a horse's instinctive reaction to anything new or strange is not stop and investigate and let's see what's up. It's to run away and run as fast and far away as possible. So they have a really honed in flight response. So anytime they're startled or feel like they're in danger, they are going to, their first reaction is to run away. Now, if there's no place to run, you might see them rear to get out of the way. And you see that a lot when horses are being handled, and particularly if they're being handled unfairly, they may rear to try to get away from the handler. If they can't leave the scene, then it's possible they're going to try to fight back. So they'll use their front legs to paw, their hind legs to kick. They will bite as well. So they're pretty adept to fighting as well. Horses are also very social animals, so part of being out in the wild is congregating in a herd. And these herds were usually relatively small, you know, maybe on average size of 8 to 10 horses, primarily mares with their babies and maybe a stallion. You'd also have other groups of bachelor herds of bachelor stallions. Maybe they were younger. They didn't have a lot of sexual experience. They weren't let in close to the mares by the herd stallion. And within this herd, then, you see a lot of very natural behaviors being displayed with these horses. So there's a lot of caregiving going on from horse to horse, a lot of playing, especially with the younger horses. And male horses are more apt to play as well. So even in our domestic type setting, you might see geldings getting into a little bit more trouble and playing a little bit harder with other horses than you would the mare. Horses will tend to mimic each other. They'll also show vigilance. So if they hear or see something, again, they'll tend to leave. And the other horses, seeing that horse act out in a vigilance type style, will chase after that horse as well and leave the scene, even though they have no idea why they're running. So there's the herd behavior dynamics that we want to pay attention to. And then there's also the dominance hierarchy within a herd. And, you know, dominance hierarchy with us, with our democratic standpoint in mind, doesn't seem very fair, but within a herd, it helps keep everything in order. And it actually decreases the amount of acting out or physical type aggression you might see within a herd if the dominance hierarchy is not disrupted. So within that dominance hierarchy, you're going to have a horse on the high end of the totem pole and then the other one on the low end of the totem pole. And the horse that's on the high end is going to get to eat first. They will have a preference to seeking shelter. And they may also be the one that comes up to new horses on the scene. So within this dominance hierarchy, as long as the group maintains some stability, you don't see a lot of infighting. But if you introduce a new animal to this herd, that's when you might see a dramatic increase in activity and displays of aggressive behavior. We also know that because horses are very social animals, when we isolate horses from other horses or other animals in general, that can lead to some abnormal behaviors. So when we're looking at abnormal behaviors, horses can display stereotypy type behaviors. And a stereotypy is what we used to call stall vices, but now we realize that it's really them adjusting to some stresses placed upon them, usually through our own management practices. So a stereotypy is going to be any repetitive behavior that's performed with no obvious discernible function. So one stereotypy that we're really concerned with developing in our horses is that of cribbing, where a horse will latch on to an object with its mouth and then suck in air. So it's different than wood chewing. We see a lot of wood chewing with horses that are isolated as well, but this is a little different, and it can actually do have some harmful effects to horses. So we'll watch a little video here of a horse cribbing. And this actually is my son's favorite video. But you can actually hear the sucking in of the air. If you want to watch that a little bit more, it's on our My Horse University YouTube channel. So that's one behavior that you'll see in horses that are stalled without a lot of turnout. And then we're also concerned with horses developing a weaving type behavior. And so our next video is just really short and shows a horse doing the kind of pacing and stall weaving that you would see. Now, the interesting thing with both cribbing and weaving is that while they may have a genetic component to them, they're initiated in horses that are stalled. So if these horses had never been stalled throughout their life, the likelihood that they would exhibit that type of behavior is very minimal to no chance. Some other risk factors, though, besides isolation, would be limited to no turnout, a low forage diet, stress, and then again, just that genetic predisposition to exhibit the stereotypies. And we have a really good webinar, actually, by Dr. Cami Holeski that talks a little bit more about behavior and stereotypies within on our YouTube channel. So we definitely want to manage these horses and house them in such a way that we avoid abnormal behaviors from developing. Another aspect, though, of housing horses that's a little bit more unique is stallion behavior. Now, out in the wild, of course, stallions would either work with a group of mares and breed with them, or they would be in more of a band of other stallions that didn't have access to mares. But in a more confined environment, we have to manage our stallions, and usually we're managing them so that they don't have access to mares at their whim. Most of the breeding that occurs these days isn't accomplished out on the pasture in a more natural setting, but in the breeding barn. So we keep our stallions usually from interacting with mares, except if we want the mares to be bred. And in the past, we've tended to isolate our stallions. We actually will build a separate stallion barn away from the other farm activity, keep them housed separately so that they don't see a lot of comings and goings of the other horses on the farm. But recent research has suggested that this probably isn't to the best interest of the stallion and can create a lot of angst in stallion behavior. So rather than isolating these horses, it's better to put them in the mainstream. So at Michigan State, for example, we have our, I call it the show barn, but it's the new barn. And typically we house all of our stallions in that barn, and then also horses that are currently being shown or horses that are injured. And the stallions, while they're on one end of the barn, they're housed next to each other, and they can see out of their stalls to the other horses directly across from them. And they're just part of that, that farm management system within that barn. So they're mainstreamed into our system. They also get daily turnout. But in general, if you're housing stallions, you want to make sure that they have more space to aid with their activity, and that when they are turned out, that the fencing can easily contain them. I actually prefer fencing for stallions that's more of a diamond mesh, so that people can't reach in and try to pet stallions because they may be more apt to bite. And I like to see that fencing at least 6 to 7 foot high to keep stallions from challenging the fence. But again, our turnout paddocks are right in the center of the farm, so the stallions are still seeing quite a bit of activity all around them. We lead our school horses right next to their paddock area and everything. So they are part of our daily routine here. Another aspect of turnout for stallions would also be using a double fence line to keep stallions from being able to reach over the fence and get to another horse or another stallion. So there's some different issues that you have when you have stallions on the premises. And one thing I wanted to remind you, because every once in a while I'll get to a farm and this isn't known, but a young colt, once he becomes sexually active, has no regards for family lines. So you will see sons breeding with the mares, their dams, and you'll also see brothers and sisters from the same dam breeding each other. So you want to keep colts separate from females regardless of family lines. So if we really want to try to replicate what is a more natural environment for a horse, then we're usually looking at more of an outdoor housing system. So when we think about keeping horses outdoors and we want to utilize the pasture as a nutritional resource, then we usually need at least 2 acres per horse, and that's on pretty good lush pasture. Once you get out into areas out west, that may creep up to 4, 6, 8 acres per horse, depending on how much available forage you have. And some of the behavioral benefits of keeping horses in groups out on pasture. At Michigan State, Dr. Brian Nielsen and his exercise physiology lab has done quite a bit of work in young horses in bone development. And early on, he found, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, what I want to cite is some of the behavioral work with young horses out on pasture. And what we found from that standpoint is horses that are housed out on pasture are easier to train under saddle than their counterparts that are stalled. And this makes a lot of sense, right? Horses out on pasture are typically going to be a little bit more relaxed. They've run off some of that steam. So we would expect them when we bring them in to be a little bit more relaxed, even when they're starting the training process. But this is also beneficial for us that have horses in our backyard. And we don't necessarily ride them every day because we have other stuff going on. If they're out in the pasture, we can still bring them up 2 or 3 times a week, and we probably won't have to lunge them down quite as much before we take off and ride them. So if we house horses out on pasture, we probably should provide them some shelter from the elements and the biting insects. I really like the open shed concept out in a paddock or a pasture. This has a lot of benefits, providing the horse with plenty of fresh air. If you have horses that have respiratory issues or are a little heavy, this can be a huge benefit housing them outside. The shed allows some protection from the weather. And they're pretty easy to upkeep. You do need to clean them out, at least once a week, depending on how much they're being used. You don't want to let the manure pile up where you end up with more of a manure shed than a housing shed. From a spatial requirement standpoint, you want to allow for at least 150 square foot of space per horse under the roof. When you're picking the site that you're going to put the shed on, you want to pick the higher spot in your pasture where there's access to a good breeze as well as good drainage. If you're building a permanent shed, then it makes a lot of sense to prepare the foundation the same way you would as if you were building a permanent barn someplace, so that you're excavating and putting in a nice base layer of material that will provide good footing and drainage even in the wetter times of the year. And some of these smaller sheds, you can even put them on skids and move them around. And I've seen people not necessarily change their locations, but they'll move the skid off the pad temporarily to use a tractor and front end loader to clean up the manure buildup, and then move the shed back into place so it's on fresh ground again. The more of an overhang you can have from your shed, the better off you are. That'll help keep the rain out of the inside of the shed where the horses are congregating. I've seen sheds that end up with more water on the inside than the outer portion of the shed, just because the ground, if it's again not built up enough, will get really low inside the shed. And the rain, if there's not a lot of overhang, will just come right into the shed. So when we're talking about housing horses outside, we should also talk about what I call sacrifice lots. Some people will call them mud lots. We'll talk a little bit about that. Or holding pens. So these would be smaller lots where you would put horses. Let's say you have horses out in pasture, but you want to bring them up closer to your farm activity during the daytime. We do this with our schooling horses at the MSU farm. at night and on the weekends and on their off days, they're always out in the big pasture lots. But when we have a lot of activities where we're using them during the day, we bring them up into smaller holding pens. But you can also do this to help save your pasture. So especially right now where we have a lot of early spring rain, Michigan is extremely wet right now. And so we're advising people to get their horses off of those new spring pastures and put them into some sort of holding pen to keep them from really roughing up their pasture and ruining their grazing land. So a sacrifice lot, then, you need to allow for about 600 foot of space per horse within a sacrifice lot. If you get it too crowded, you're just going to increase the risk of fighting and bumping around and, you know, chasing a horse around the pen. You want to also ensure that there's enough drainage. So it's good if it's set up a little higher and there's some slope down to where there's a place for moisture to go. You can actually even tile this area so that you have drainage in this pen, because if you don't, and if you look at the upper picture here, horses will really turn this, and this is why a lot of people call it the mud lot. They'll really turn these small lots into a mud bin pretty quick. The other component of that is you want to make sure that you remove the manure, again, at least on a weekly basis. And this will help decrease on the mud so that you're not mixing a lot of organic material with your soil. From a fencing standpoint, you want to make sure that the fencing around these small sacrifice lots is a very solid fence. Because it'll get a lot more pressure as you put more horses into these small lots. They'll tend to hit that fence a little bit more. That being said, then, you want to avoid using electricity in these small lots because since the horses will be bumping on the fence, it's really just not fair to have them get shocked because somebody's kind of bullying them and they're trying to get away. In addition, make sure that horses have access to food and water, water 24/7 and food as needed when they're up in these small lots. So looking at group housing then, this is if you need to bring horses indoors, you may want to consider using more of a group housing scenario than individually stalling them. And both of these pictures were actually taken in Europe. And in Europe, you'll see more of the older dairy barns and stuff being converted for equestrian use. And within those systems, then, rather than putting up stalls, they'll leave the facility open like you would see in a lot of your dairy barns. And they'll house groups of small groups of horses just in the open space. And, you know, this obviously allows for a little bit more social interaction with these horses. So putting these horses in a more of a natural setting. You need to have really stable groups for this to work. This would not be the kind of system if you always have horses going in and out of a group. So probably not a great system if you have a show string where horses are leaving and returning to the premises fairly often. But if you have horses that are used to each other and stuff, it sure might be an option for you. As you look at spatial requirements, these horses are going to need at least 150 foot of space per horse. They need enough space so that they can eat, lie down, avoid confrontation. When we talk about food, feeding and these types of environments, horses are usually pretty good about sharing hay. You don't see a lot of roughhousing going on around the round pen feeder, as long as you keep the group small enough so that everybody has access. So usually we say if you're using a round pen or a round bale feeder, you want to have around 4 to 7 horses around that feeder at one time. Any more than that, and horses are going to have a hard time getting access to the feed. But horses will act out over grain. That's when things tend to get a little bit more aggressive. So if you were feeding in this type of system, if you were also trying to feed grain to these horses, you might have a really long trough where you can spread out that grain over a distance, or you may have individual feeders for each horse. So let's say you have 3 horses in a group, you may put out an extra feeder, so you actually would fill 4 of the buckets up with enough feed to feed 3 horses, so that that horse that again is on the low end of the hierarchy system will have a feeder to go to, even if the horse on the high end kicks him off of a feeder. So if we're going to stall horses then, and we're concerned about social interactions, there's some things we can do when we bring horses indoors and stall them to create a more natural type setting for the horse. And one is to offer horses more visual contact with other horses. And so the picture down below here is a horse at our MSU barn. And as you can see, the front door is totally screened so the horse can visually see out. What you can't see as well is inside the stalling, we actually have around eye level for this horse another portion of a screen, and on the very bottom there's a screen that goes around. So the horses can actually see the horses on either side of them as well. Now that outer window is screened, but it allows for natural light to come into the stall. We also use some clear siding towards the top of the barn so that we have more natural light entering the barn as a whole. And so all of this aids in social interactions with the horses within the barn, so they can easily see each other, they can see the horses from side to side, they can put their nose up to each other and smell each other through the screen portion. They can hear each other, obviously, they just can't touch each other. And from a movement standpoint, we want to make sure that they have enough space to lay down and to turn around. So when we're looking at actual spacing requirements, you know, for a small horse, you could get by with a 10 by 10 foot stall. For an average horse, you're looking at least a 10 by 12. And for larger horses, you're going to need at least a 12 by 12 foot stall. And from my standpoint, I really like to see you use as big of a stall as you can with your horse. Sometimes we think, well, I just have Arabs, so I'm going to stick with this 10 by 10 stall scenario, which is fine until you decide you really want a warm blood. And that warm blood is just not going to be very comfortable in that 10 by 10 foot stall. Or if you decide to sell your facility, that may be a problem for potential buyers if they have to renovate that stall to fit their larger size horses. So we usually recommend that you go with the larger size stalls if you can. You want to make sure that there's plenty of room overhead. They need at least 10 feet. And then more if you're riding in the alleyways or riding in arena. For overhead, for jumping, you need 15 to 16 feet as well to help clear headroom. Now, if we're looking at foaling stalls or stallions, we're usually looking at doubling that size for horses to comfortably foal, and for the foal to get up and find the mare and to nurse the mare without too much getting in the way. So I always suggest too, working with people if they're building new stalls in a barn, to try to develop stalls to where at least the inside partitions are removable. So that way you can take 2 normal stalls, just remove that middle partition, and now you have a really nice foaling stall, or a stall that's bigger if you have to have a horse that needs stall rest for a considerable length of time, or for a more active stallion. Within our barn aisles then, we kind of take on that same standpoint. We want to keep our barn aisles as wide as possible. This allows for horses, if they spook, to have a place to go within the barn aisle, but it also lets you get equipment in and out of your barn a little bit easier. Again, staying with the height. And also the higher your ceiling is, the more fresh air you're going to be able to take into your barn. The surface of your barn aisles should provide appropriate traction. So if you have a cemented aisle, it should be roughed up as that cement's being poured, so that the horses can get some traction. I've actually seen horses tied up on a cement floor and just lose their feet underneath them. So cement floors can get really slick, especially over time. The lighting, as much natural light as you can put in a barn, the better off you're going to be. From an aisleway standpoint, I'm really concerned that horses have more limited actual contact, because if horses are reaching over their stall door, trying to bite another horse when you're walking down the aisle, that's an accident waiting to happen. The same as if you're side-by-side grooming. You can see our grooming racks at our MSU horse farm. We have barriers and the horses are cross-tied. So you can have a horse that gets into a little bit of a wreck in one of these enclosures, and it still not affect the other horses in the same tie-up line. So you really want to consider safety in your barn aisleways. You also want to keep your barn aisleways clear. I don't care for tack boxes in front of stalls. They just get a little too trippy when you're leading horses in and out, especially if you have a horse that spooks. So again, talking about open access, you know, I love seeing horses have their head out of a stall door. It's just a very pretty picture. However, it can also lead to problems down the road. So especially if you have a public barn where you have a lot of different horse handling abilities around you, a lot of different horses going in and out. If a horse has his head stuck over the barn, you're just asking for that horse to bite the other horse and cause an accident. Another problem with horses having their head out of the stall, a lot of horses will start doing a lot of weird things orally, you know, sticking out their tongue, raising their head, shaking their head to get attention from even just people walking around the aisleway. So that creates kind of a goofy behavior that I probably don't want in your own horse. I've also seen stalling areas where horses have access to another horse on the in the other stall, and this can lead to a lot of chewing off of manes and tails. So probably not a great idea, especially if you're keeping your horse in show shape. And again, young horses, if you have an open area inside the stall, may try to challenge that open area by jumping out. There's been quite a few accidents caused by horses getting caught up on the stall door. So just some things to think about. If you're on your own farm, you've got just a small group of horses, there's probably no harm at all in keeping the stalls a little bit more open, but I wouldn't recommend it for a public facility. So next we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about temperature regulation, and this is where we really want to think about creature comfort versus human comfort. So a horse's body temperature is normally, an adult horse is normally around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Healthy horses can easily adapt to the climates around them. And so, for instance, a horse in, quote unquote, mild Canadian winter, which is pretty extreme for horses probably living in the South, they have a thermoneutral zone between 5 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And that just means that within 5 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, they don't have to expend any energy to stay comfortable. So 5 degrees Fahrenheit, that's pretty cold. I grew up in Texas, so that would just be freezing to me back then. Now that I've lived in Michigan and I've survived our Arctic blast of this last year, that doesn't seem so bad. We were looking for some single digits this winter to get out of the 0 and below. So horses are pretty comfortable in temperatures that we as humans would be very uncomfortable in, and we need to keep that in mind. I am more concerned with extreme high temperatures. So I saw horses affected more by hot weather, especially when it was combined with high humidity when I grew up in Texas, than I've seen horses negatively affected by cold temperatures here in Michigan. So if we think about keeping horses in hot weather, the main mechanism that horses have to dissipate heat is through sweating. So horses, as horses sweat, that sweat will evaporate into a gas in the air, and that will help keep horses cooled down. Now, as we increase the humidity in the environment, their ability to use that evaporative heat loss decreases. So that's one thing we want to keep in mind. Radiation from the sun can heat up a horse pretty fast, and that's why we want to make sure that we provide shade for horses. I have seen horses kept in little paddocks in Texas without any access to shade, have some problems with heat stress and getting pretty sick because of that. So you want to make sure you provide shade to help them with heat of radiation. Heat of or losing heat through convection is dependent on the amount of airflow going across the horse, as well as horses can lose heat as we put water on the horse. So a lot of times down south especially, you'll see misters in stalls, and so it'll mist over the horse, and that'll help with the heat loss through convection. Horses also lose heat through respiratory. So as they exhale and get rid of that CO2, they're actually cooling down as well. But this is important when we think about their respiratory health, and we'll talk about that here in a sec. Horses in general will decrease their activity in hot weather. In the summertime, they'll tend to have that nice thin summer coat that lays flat. They'll dilate their vessels, and they'll seek shade. One thing to note is our overweight horses will have a harder time cooling off. So when we house horses in hot weather, we need to make sure that they have access to shade, and not just to help with their heat dissipation, but also to protect them from biting insects. So even in Michigan, where it doesn't necessarily get quite as hot, we want to provide them with some shade so that during the early morning hours and the dusky hours when the biting bugs are out, they can find a place to get away from them. We want to ensure that they have natural airflow. That's pretty easy to do when horses are outside, but when we bring them inside, it gets to be a little harder. So by increasing ceiling height, by providing some fans, by providing a lot of airflow through using partitions like the one below where it's nice and airy, that's going to all go to help keep horses with a little bit more airflow. When we're looking at cold temperature regulation, then horses actually do really well out in the cold. And even in some pretty extreme weather, you'll look out and horses will have access to shelters, but they'll choose to just hang out with each other outside. A horse's winter coat will fluff up, and within that, between the hair and the skin, it'll actually be able to maintain some warm air in that fluff, and that'll help keep the horse warm. Now, if that coat gets wet, that's going to disassemble the horse's ability to stay warm with their hair coat. So that's another good reason to provide them some shelter, especially from the rain and really wet snow. Body fat is critical on a horse. If a thin horse will have a lot harder time regulating their body temperature in cold weather. Allowing horses to have free access to forage will help increase their heat of digestion as they ferment that fiber. So that's another strategy for keeping horses in cold weather. Sometimes you'll see horses shivering, and if I see a horse shiver a little bit, that's okay, but if it's constant, then that may mean that they're having some trouble regulating their body temperature, and you need to change your strategy for them. From a behavioral change, they'll tend to group up more, keep their butts towards the wind. They may seek shelter, then again, they may not. So there's a little bit of difference between horses on that and what they're used to. If you do have an older or thin horse, you may also want to provide them with a waterproof blanket during winter turnout to help them stay warm. Again, horses can withstand temperatures even below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you look at this picture to the side, this is a nice strategy. This is a farm in Traverse City, which is northern Michigan. And this was right during the Arctic blast. And this owner had several different locations of hay for the horses to get. So the horses were moving around to different locations. They kind of had their choice where they wanted to locate. They had some trees for some wind coverage and a shelter in back and access to fresh water. So they did very well during our Arctic blast. From a respiratory health standpoint, Some air quality factors that we're concerned with are airflow. We're also concerned with oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. Again, the humidity level, we want to keep humidity within the barn between 60 and 70%. We want to avoid a buildup of harmful gas like ammonia from manure and urine waste. And we want to keep the dust levels down for respiratory health. Now, if you have a horse with respiratory issues, heaves, obstructed airways, usually your veterinarian is going to recommend that you house that horse outdoors, because again, you have the natural airflow, you have easy gas exchange for the horse, you avoid the harmful gases like ammonia buildup that can happen in a stall, and you decrease the horse's exposure to dust. But if you have a horse indoors, then you need to think of some other ways to ensure that they have quality ventilation. Well, one thing you don't want to do, if you look down at the picture on the bottom here, you know, we have a horse here where we have the more open stall front, but we've totally covered up one way for the gases and the carbon dioxide to leave the stall by covering that the top of the stall with hay. So I usually recommend that you store your hay in a different building other than your where your horses are stalled. For one, this is helpful from a fire prevention standpoint in your stable. But also, if you're storing hay above the horses' heads, that's going to limit the amount of airflow. So another thing you can think about if you're housing horses indoor is your barn layout. So within your barn layouts, you have some different scenarios. If you have just a row of stalls with an alleyway, it's pretty easy to get airflow through the alleyways, open doors. Maybe you have some windows in your stalls to the outside, so you have quite a bit of airflow. The same thing for the double row of stalls with the alleyway in between. There's more airflow or availability for airflow for all of the horses. Now, once we start stalling horses in more of an island configuration like we see below here, now they have maybe access to airflow from the sides, but not from the inside where their stalls are butt to butt. So that would be a little less ideal than, let's say, the single row stalls. So let's move from there to our island flanked by single row stalls. While the horses on the outermost configuration of this facility are probably going to have some access to air exchange through the windows and alleyways, our horses on the inside of this configuration are probably going to have a little bit of staler air to deal with. And moving from there then would be this configuration where we have, and you see this a lot, where you have the indoor arena with stalls on either side. And I've actually seen stalls on at least 3, if not 4 sides of an indoor arena before. And it makes sense because in the wintertime, especially if you're in Michigan, it's you really don't want to walk through snow to take your horse from their stall to the grooming area to the arena to ride. But the challenge is, now that you have this indoor arena and the stalls adjacent to it, you're going to have a lot higher dust exposure to the horses in those stalls from the indoor arena. So you need to make sure that you do a lot more maintenance to your arena to keep the dust down, and consider more of a dust-free type of footing for your indoor arena, maybe a rubber source or some of these fiber floorings that we have now might be a better option. From a natural ventilation, what your goal is to simulate the natural ventilation of outdoors into the inside of your barn. And a lot of times people don't do this because they want to keep their barn really, really warm in the winter. But again, that's really catering to your own comfort and not your horse's comfort when you do that. So when you find the site that you're going to put your building in, you want to try to orient it so you're taking advantage of prevailing winds so that you can get some airflow into your alleyways. As you build your barn, you want to build it with ventilation in mind. So you have some ventilation over the top of your barn through the roof. You have peak ventilation end to end of your barn, and you have overhang ventilation in your eaves. You can also have ventilation coming through your windows, and depending on how your barn is situated, you can have airflow going through your alleyways. And you can see this picture over here with the arrows. Those are all access points for ventilation to come through that barn. Now, it's important when you're building your barns that there's not other buildings that are actually blocking airflow into your stabling area. Now, the very bottom picture, you see cupolas, and cupolas have to be really big to actually provide any additional ventilation for your barn. Usually cupolas are more of a decorative type venture. So either if you're using cupolas as to help with barn ventilation, make sure that they're big enough, and also that there's enough of them on your roof span to make a difference. So in Michigan, we'll have some show barns that are actually heated, which can really complicate the standpoint of good fresh airflow in the barn. So if you're using a heated system for your barn, you're probably also going to have to use some mechanical ventilation so that you can actually bring fresh air into your barn through one fan and expel it out with the other fan. Something else that you'll see quite a bit in the summertime are fans in stall fronts. And if you use fans in your stall front, make sure first that they're made for outdoor usage, even if you're using them inside the barn, just because there's more chance of moisture exposure inside a barn. But also make sure that the wiring is kept away from horses. Ideally, you want to see that wiring in conduit so that neither the horses nor squirrels or whatever are going to chew through that wire and cause a barn fire. So finally, when we're thinking about housing, we're also concerned with the skeletal health of our horses. And bone is a very dynamic tissue. So when we're younger, bone's responding to forces to develop and to strengthen. And even as we're older, bone needs exposure to force through exercise to maintain its strength. So again, some research done here at Michigan State has shown that weanlings who were stalled actually had weaker bone development or lower bone strength than their counterparts that were housed out in pastures. And that's just because the pastured horses had more exposure to fast sprints than the stalled weanlings. Typically, when we exercise horses, we don't run them on a full-out sprint. But outside, if they have the the area to run, they will sprint, and that helps keep their bones stronger. And we know even for adult horses that our adult horses that are kept outside and allowed free exercise tend to be more flexible and have more higher bone strength than their counterparts that are kept inside. So when we talk about stalling horses indoors, it's important that we allow them some turnout so that they can do just that, have some free exercise. And, you know, there hasn't been a whole lot of research that really suggests how much they need to benefit them. But I think that most horse people would say the more the better, but probably at least 3 hours a day is very helpful to keep a horse fresh psychologically, and also help them from a physical standpoint. If you want a horse to benefit from exercising outside and the sprinting type, running fast type activity, they need to have a long enough area to get some speed up. So usually in that scenario, you're looking at turnouts that are at least 100 feet long so they can pick up some speed. But any turnout that allows for social interaction, even if it's individual paddocks where they can see each other through the fence, is positive for the horse's psychological well-being. Again, we want to make sure that water's provided in these turnout areas, that there's some shade available, and also consider that as your horse is turned out, if they have grass to eat, that grass should be considered as part of their feeding program. So you don't want to feed them normally if you're providing them 4 hours of turnout, because that grass that they're taking in 4 hours, and they're going to be going all out trying to eat as much as they can within that time, is going to provide a considerable amount of energy into their as a feed source. And if you don't consider that as a feed source, then you're probably going to end up with overweight horses pretty quick. As we're keeping horses in a turnout type situation, we want to make sure that our fencing is adequate to keep the horses on the inside of the fence, but also to keep other people and predators on the outside of the fence. So fencing should provide a physical barrier, and that means that the height needs to be tall enough, 5 foot minimum, and that it's strong enough so that if a horse does hit the fence, that it stays intact, especially when we're talking about our perimeter fences that may be the only barrier between our horses and the traffic in the streets. The fencing should also provide a psychological barrier so that the horse doesn't challenge the fence. So the fence needs to be visible. And when we're talking about wired fence, or even white fence with a snowy background, we want to make sure that we tape them up enough so that horses can easily see them. Electricity, a little strand of electricity on a fence will also increase the horse's, increase that psychological mindset that the horse doesn't want to challenge that fence. So in summary, you know, obviously outdoor housing provides more opportunities usually for social interaction, especially in a group type setting. If you don't have other horses, some horses will interact with other livestock species. You just have to be careful that you don't have a horse that is chewing on your goat's ear or chasing down your goat. Or whatever. Outdoor housing provides more fresh air and free exercise, so you would expect less respiratory disease and healthier bone development through outdoor housing. When we move horses indoors, obviously we have easier access to the horse. We can keep them a little bit more ready by regulating their environment. It also gives us a little bit of an easier way to feed horses. And there's, of course, the perception of decreased injury. However, if you do house horses indoors, you want to make sure that you prioritize the ventilation of your barn, as well as ensuring that they have plenty of exercise and free turnout. And so with that, I know we're running a little over here. Are there any questions? Great. Then their counterparts that were housed out.
So we did have one question through Facebook that came up, and it was a question a little bit earlier about barriers within your stall, and I think they were referring to what type of barriers you would use, whether it's the bars or mesh, that type of thing.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and the one slide that I showed you with our MSU barriers, I think is a really nice way to go, because it's solid enough to where horses aren't really intimidated by their neighbors. But it also allows for some airway both below and up high for airflow to go through. And that's kind of a nice way to go. You'll see stall interiors where it's extremely open. And if you have really stable horses and you monitor horses' interaction with each other, that can work out really nice as well. You just have to make sure if you have kind of a bully of a horse that you keep them on that end stall, so they're not terrorizing the horse next to them, especially around feeding time and whatnot. Again, the more access you give to horses between the stall, the more issues you have from a biosecurity standpoint or spreading disease. But if you have a pretty closed and stable herd, that's really not any more of an issue than keeping them outside together.
Okay, we have another question here from Lindsay. Could you please comment on rehabilitating high traffic areas in pastures or sacrifice lots that have turned into mud pits, especially if there isn't an option to keep horses off of the pasture for an extended period of time?
Yeah, and that's a problem that we all have. And really the only way to work on a sacrifice lot like that is to excavate the soil, put in a more permeable hard surface like some limestone and gravel, and then put some sand or soil back on top of that. So developing a little bit of a crown over that area as well. The sacrifice lot will never be a lot where you're growing grass from a nutritional standpoint. And that's why we call it a sacrifice lot. And if you don't do some real excavation work, most of the areas that are sacrifice lots will get quite a lot of mud in it. So by excavating, putting in, just like you would if you were building a new arena flooring, digging out that material, putting in a good base layer of material like crushed limestone, putting in good sandy dirt on top of that for drainage can go a long way in helping with those materials. There's nothing, unfortunately, you can seed those small lots with that's going to grow and withstand the pressure that the horses are going to put on it. So it's usually making sure site location is high, and then if you really want to keep that lot nice, you've got to kind of treat it like you would a riding surface, where you build it up and level it out.
Right, we have another question from Christine. She's asking, she's a relatively new horse owner with a horse boarded at a show barn. If there's mud outside, her trainer turns out her horse in the arena because they're afraid that because they don't want to pull a shoe. What is the benefit versus risk of shoe issues versus not turning out?
Well, horses will definitely lose shoes in the mud. I had one horse that I couldn't keep shoes on him out when I had him turned outside. So I totally understand where your trainer is coming from. And letting your horse run inside the arena is definitely an option. I would make sure that the inside of that arena is very safe, though. I've had horses that have run into mirrors that were hanging on arena walls and gotten severely injured from that, or run into jumps or standards that are in the arena. So as long as that arena is safe, that is, I think your trainer is definitely thinking along the right lines. If he wants to keep shoes on your horse, that's the best way to go. So the longer the horse can stay in that arena and running, the better. And the sooner you can put them back out on a dry lot, the better off your horse will be.
All right, well, I think those are the questions that we've had so far. I mentioned a couple other things, and maybe there'll be some more questions that come in. We really appreciate everyone joining our webinar today. I just want to let you know that when you leave this webinar, you will be directed to a survey. And if you have a few minutes and could complete that survey, that would really help us out as we build new programs and bring new topics to you through My Horse University. We will also be following up in a couple of days with a link to the recording of today's webinar, and we'll include in that a link to the survey as well. So once again, thank you to everyone for attending today. For more information about our online courses and webinars and articles that we have online, please check out our website at myhorseuniversity.com. And you might also want to like us on Facebook as well at facebook.com/myhorseu. So Chris, thank you again, once again, for speaking today, and thank you for everyone who has joined.